Circuit 42 would like to thank Pop Culture Paradise, Toy Anxiety, the Spawn Point Gamers Lounge, and Dragon's Lair San Antonio.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of Circuit 42. We are here with special guest, author and screenwriter and comic writer, Joe Lansdale. Joe, how are you doing today?
Hello. Glad to be here, guy.
So, for those 5 people on the internet who don't know who you are, who don't know what you do, who are you and what do you do?
Well, I'm a freelance writer. I have been for most of my life. Sold my first piece in 1921. No, I sold the first piece in 1973. I've been writing for over 40 years, and I've been full-time over 30.
Now, in your career, you've definitely had a variety of work. You've worked in a different variety of mediums, from television to comic books to literature. Well, what is your favorite medium to work in as a writer?
I like prose, meaning short stories and novels. Those are my absolute favorites. They're the things that got me into this career in the first place. I always wanted to tell stories. I wanted to write novels. I wanted to write short stories. That doesn't mean I don't enjoy the others, but writing prose is first and foremost for me.
And one of the big things as a writer, as a writer who's done a lot of crossover work, we had the art director for Bubba Ho-Tep on a couple of weeks ago. And,
cool.
And he was talking about how when he and Don read the book, read the short story Bubba Ho-Tep that you wrote, how he thought that they thought there would be a good amount of adaptation, but when he read it, he said that it flowed so well that there was really barely anything that they had to change in regards to the writing style.
Well, that's true, man. I mean, I was, of all the adaptations of my work, it's the absolute closest to the written page. I think the reason for that is that Don was willing to take some chances. He was willing to stick to the story. I think people get scared a lot of times when they stick to the story because they get so many working parts going. They're afraid it's not all working. It's not all going to come together. And that frequently it can be correct. But the other flip side of that is when they have the quote spirit of, unquote, which it can be in the spirit of, and that's certainly partly true. But when I hear that, I usually expect that means I'm fixing to get, run over by a truck, because it means that they can't seem to follow it, don't know how to make it work, or whatever. And I think there's just people that just feel driven to change for no reason at all. And so over my career, in different times, things that did not get made, many of them went through these bizarre changes and strange outlooks where they just wanted the germ of the idea, or they would decide to do something that I thought totally undercut the project. Fortunately for me, those did not get made. But I do believe that as someone who has adapted a number of my own books and written screenplays, that you can get much closer to the book more often than screenwriters actually do. And I think that it's because they're given such carte blanche to think that it can't be adapted literally. And obviously it cannot be absolutely literal, but most stories, if they're a good story, will surprisingly lend themselves to almost a direct adaptation. You lose certain things, and there's certain pacing and certain, obviously, the descriptions do not go into the film, and you just visualize things. In the book, when you read words, you can see them the way you want to, but in a film, you have to actually see what that house looks like, or what that woods looks like, or whatever. And I think that that's one of the things that you drop, but there's so much there that if the story's good, and you're courageous, and you're willing just to go with the power of the story itself, it'll generally work.
Now, one of the things I've noticed, speaking of adaptations, is your recent work on Son of Batman, adapting Grant Morrison's work, and on Jonah Hex with Jimmy Palmiotti's short story. And I noticed that one of the big things that you did in those, while there were a few things added, I really didn't necessarily see a whole lot of actual changes from the source material. Now, do you think it's because of the...
No.
Huh?
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, is it because of the fact that, especially if you look at something like the recent Sin City movies, is it kind of the idea that you have you basically have a storyboard right there, and it gives you something to work with?
It's true. Yeah, no, absolutely. And the thing is, you got to understand that when you do these adaptations for Warner Brothers, a plot synopsis and say, we want you to adapt this to film. We want you to make a script out of this basic storyline. Or, like in the case of, say, Son of Batman, Robinson had broken it down in such a way that it was laid out that this is what happens and this is what happens. And then I was to take what that, when I had read the comics too. But when you're working in film too, and it's one of the things, I think that you can actually be closer than they often allow you to be. And, because I think they start saying, well, people have read the comic books, they want something a little different, so it'll surprise them here. But I think a lot of times that undercuts more than you like for people who enjoyed the comics. And I think too that they have this position where they're trying to walk the line between having adults or young adults like it, as well as having younger viewers like it. And I think that they try to please everybody so much that sometimes it's difficult. And when I worked for Batman the Animated Series, I was very happy, though, with that, because people let me write the way I wanted to write. I used the basic, concept, which was usually just a very short, little synopsis, and I broke it into the teleplays, and they pretty much shot them just like I wrote them. And Son of Batman, I was the same, but I had to work on it a little bit more to try to balance it between those two chairs. It wasn't like when we did Batman the Animated Series, which was definitely something that younger people could like, but it was written with intelligence and depth. And I think Son of Batman was certainly written with that intent, but it was also, I think, a little bit more conscious of trying to hit that middle ground. And I think it did it. But I think that, I think I would have enjoyed a much more direct adaptation of the comics, to be honest.
Yeah, because you and Grant Morrison, one of the things I've found as a fan that you both have in common is a very precise choice of word. Like, when it comes to what you say and how you say it, they both are equally important. And I think when you have a writer who does that, the best thing is to try to, while bringing in your personal style, also being able to channel that precise choice of word by the choice of the writer.
Right. Well, it's true. In spite of what I said, I do think that when you adapt something, that when you adapt something that's really well known, I think you want people to recognize it to some extent. But in some cases, if you're doing Batman, even taken outside of an individual story, if you're a really good writer, you're bringing something of yourself to it. I mean, a Batman is not a static character. If you've read Batman, throughout your life, or if you've gone back and read the archives, you can see how Batman has evolved with different generations and different ideas and different artists. It's designed to be interpreted that way more than books and short stories, which I guess is what I was truly defending there. But I do think that if something's really well known, like that comic, that it needs to be as much like it as possible, but yet it needs to have its own flair and something special brought to it. When I did the Lone Ranger comics, they were just that, you made up your own story, and you were trying to modernize and bring the Lone Ranger comics to a new group of readers in a different way, and you were trying to do it in such a way that you're bringing more of yourself to it. I guess it's a personal choice with these things, but that said, even though I did bring it updated and change some elements and stuff, I did not change the core of who the Lone Ranger and Tonto were. And it's a tough tightrope. It really is. It's a hard one to walk,
Exactly. You actually, speaking of Batman, you mentioned the animated series, and you actually wrote one of my absolute favorite episodes of the animated series, and that was Perchance to Dream. And
yeah, I had fun doing that.
It was just such a completely unique episode. I'd really never seen anything like that either in the comic books or the TV show. And you were talking about the freedom just to create that you had while working with Batman. What was it that made you come up with such a unique concept, at least in the way it was executed?
Well, a lot of times they would throw the concept out there and say, build the story around this. This is the basic idea that we're after. So they often came up with the concepts, and then you added to those concepts to the point where you brought your own ideas to their basic construct. And but they gave you so much freedom in that show. Michael Reeves, who was my story editor, was just fantastic. He's a nice guy, too. He's a good short story writer as well. And he was someone who knew how to work with me, and I knew how to work with him. We understood each other. That's also something else. The difference when you write film or you write animation, or comics or whatever, you're not just working with you or for you. You're writing something to be interpreted by a number of people. And when I did 4 that are in the Batman the Animated collection, but only 3 of those were actually Batman the Animated series. One of them was Batman, The Adventures of Batman and Robin, or something that came later. I can't remember the exact title. And those were also geared somewhat for more younger viewers. And every time they do that, they think that they need to, dumb it down a little bit. And in that one, we did kind of a parody and a little bit of a satire on Critters. But all of those 4 things, and especially those first 3, I really felt that I got the right kind of respect, and they let me just, say go for it. And when I saw them, actually done, I was very pleased. And For Chance to Dream is certainly one I'm very proud of.
The thing that I've noticed, and I don't know if you agree on this or not, is that while the Batman books were very much the exception, because Chuck Dixon and Doug Moench were doing some very good work on the Batman books in the 90s, you look at comic books in the 90s, and you look at comic book animation in the 90s, but then you look at comic books today, and there seems to be a lot more of that creativity that was coming into, like, Batman the Animated Series and a lot of the Paul Dini, Bruce Timm productions in comics today than there was then.
Absolutely. Bruce Timm is a brilliant guy, and he had a vision for that sort of thing. And what Timm did, and one reason I think I enjoyed working on the series so much, is that he was able to capture the Batman elements that I love from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and that dark vision that was going around in the 80s of Batman, and combine all of those things into some sort of flavorful stew that was most unexpected. For him to be able to come up with it and blend all of that together, it was nostalgic. It was also, and it was progressive at the same time. It was doing things that hadn't been done. If somebody says, what's the best Batman movie ever? I say, it's the Batman the Animated Series. I like it better than all of the versions. I think the last versions of the film were really good, but there was something about those others that though they were dark, they were always centered with some sort of humanity, and I think that's the way Batman has been established, especially after, the earliest creation when he used to have the 45 in the sports car. But I think that that's what makes Batman Batman, is that even though it's dark, there's a core of humanity there, and I think that those captured it, where the movies made him perhaps more nihilistic, a little, not completely, but a little bit more so than I think that he was meant to be. Even when he was a dark character, I think he was meant to have that center, and I think that was done best in that animated series, almost better than anything, except, of course, when the comics were cooking. In fact, I actually think they, like you said, I think they improved on that, and then I think the comics themselves that borrowed in turn back from the animation. So I'm very pleased that my work and everybody else's work on that, and I was pleased that they won an Emmy for their Batman the Animated Series. I mean, obviously, we writers did not, or artists necessarily didn't win an Emmy, but we were at least acknowledged as part of the team, and I'm very proud of that to this day.
I gotta say, with the announcements they made for San Diego Comic-Con this weekend regarding the Batman Superman movie, when initially I was doubtful, when I saw the fact that they were dropping the black costume, finally, like the all-black armor, and actually doing the black and gray costume, and when I saw the...
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they're going to be dropping the black armor. Apparently, Affleck is a giant comic book geek, and he actually said that if we're going to do this, you've got to drop the armor. You've got to actually give it the actual Batman costume. And
I'm for that. I like that. I like hearing that.
And then, I don't know if you saw the footage that was up online for maybe like 2 hours last night, but they showed the teaser trailer for Batman vs. Superman, and he's wearing the armor from Dark Knight Returns. Like, he's actually wearing the armor that he fought Superman from the Dark Knight Returns. Which is making me really excited.
Yeah, I'm excited too. No, I'm getting good vibes off the thing. I really am. The thing is that with the exception of Batman and to some degree Superman, I think the Supermans haven't been quite as successful, but DC hasn't had the same success that Marvel has in film, but I think its animation has been really good. And I keep hoping that we're going to get, some more good DC character films. I've got The Flash is coming this fall. Of course, Arrow is on now, and those are they're somewhat geared for a specific audience to some degree, but I think they're really quite well done. And I think that's what's next in the canon, so to speak, is to see all these DC characters shot out of it, and perhaps a more interesting way than they've done in the past.
I think Arrow, the thing I love about that show is the fact that it feels like a show that's being written by fans. Like, the fact that they're bringing in Adam, and it's kind of interesting. Apparently, Brandon Roth from Superman Returns, who, honestly, I liked as Superman, even though I felt the movie was weak. I like that they're bringing him in as the Atom and giving him a second shot.
Well, I thought he was fine, I just think that it was the movie's fault. I think the last Superman movie was actually pretty good. I just thought it went on too long. I thought the fight scenes were just, after a little while, they were a little bit ridiculous. But I think that's that whole thing of trying to get the kids in there the door, and then trying to get the solid fans in there, and trying to get some adults in there, too. And I think they all try to walk these tightropes all the time because they got so much money involved. But, sometimes it takes away from what you really want to see as a dyed-in-the-wool adult fan. And I mean, I'm in my 60s, and I've been a fan of comics since I was, a kid in the 50s. So, I'm excited about it. I'm hoping that, it's going to be good. And Arrow, I actually like Arrow quite a bit. I think it's getting a little soap opera in this last season, and that's kind of like, to me, that's the curse of the channel that it's on. It started out really clean and very much like, Green Arrow's modern interpretation, which is Batman-like. Because in the old comics, when Green Arrow came along, he was like a Batman-like version, and he had a character that was his helper named Speedy, and they did very much what Batman and Robin did in the sort of 50s interpretation of Batman and Robin. Well, that's evolved where as Batman grew darker, so did Green Arrow. And so I think that they've carried that all forward, and I like that part of it. I just hope they don't, everybody's got a love triangle, and somebody's mad at somebody, and some of that just gets so heavy-handed after a while that I fear that they may lose the center of what made that good, and that's this guy and his base problems, but his desire and ability to make things better. And I like how they've made him grow from being a killer to somebody who is trying to be a better person and not, take the easy way out, so to speak. So we'll see. And The Flash, I think, is probably going to be a lighter series. I'm looking forward to it.
I'm loving the fact that with Arrow, it almost started off like Mike Grell's, and it seems to take influence from a little bit of influence from Denny O'Neil, a little bit of influence from Mike Grell, a little bit from even Chuck Dixon, and some from Kevin Smith. And I'm really loving what they're doing by bringing in all those kinds of storytelling styles.
Yeah, like I said, I'm just a little bit worried with the soap opera aspects growing and growing.
Same
I
here.
like it. And I'm not saying that you don't have characters. You have to have character problems. You have to have character arcs and things like that. But some of that becomes like, let's just take the standard one out of the bag. Somebody has a drinking problem. Somebody is in love with somebody, but that person doesn't love them, but they love somebody else they should. And it's just kind of this sort of rotation. You can just kind of take the card out and put it out there because you've seen it all so many times. And certainly those things have to be used because they're part of human nature. But I just find that channel unto itself, that its own, is primarily geared towards teenagers, and they're trying to, I think, really appeal to a female romantic audience that they interpret it, not necessarily as it is or what, but and that may be exactly the wise thing to do. But I think for me, it's one of the things that could, it has not so far, but it could damage the series.
I agree. That is definitely a risk that they're running, and I really hope they do reduce it a little more in the next season. Now, speaking of adaptations, this is something we have to bring up, especially with your work on the character, Jonah Hex.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And
my favorite weird Western character. Although, strangely enough, and I wrote about this in the introduction back in the 90s when I first did it, is when I was reading the Jonah Hex comics I started reading when they first came out, and then years later when I got the opportunity to write it, I remembered them as being much weirder than they were, but they were actually much more standard Westerns when I went back and read them, though at the time time, they were much more unique as Westerns than they appear to be now. But I remember them as having more dark and supernatural elements, and so I sort of reinvented it without actually knowing that's what I was doing. I thought I was doing it as I remembered it. But when I got into it, I decided too that I felt that he should be, if he was going to be a Confederate guy, I wanted him to be from the South that I knew. So I placed him in East Texas, which is this part of it. I wanted him to be somebody who fought for the South just because it was where he lived, not because he had shared, the same desire to have, racism and slaves and things like that. I think that he was a man of his time, but I don't think that's where his head was. I think he was just thinking, like a lot of Confederates said, I was protecting my chicken coop. And I think that's kind of what he was doing. And then, of course, it destroyed his life in many ways, or changed his life. And I wanted to take that look. But I felt, too, that he had been around long enough that he had accepted what had happened to him, and I wanted him to have an ironic way of looking at life. And when I teamed up with Tim Truman, who is, my favorite comic book artist, we were like simpatico, and so we had the greatest time, just taking this thing and running with it. And I think the first one, Two Gun Mojo, that I wrote is the best of them, because I think it's more in the tradition of the old stuff without being just like the older stuff. I went back to the John Albano creation, and not the Flasher so much, not because it's, I didn't like them, I did, but because I wanted to go back to the core and start there and let the story sort of spread out from that.
And I kind of like that, because, it's so easy to just make what was before, and it's so easy to just say, oh, let's forget about that and just do our own thing, and, well, it's a kind of a dirty word nowadays, reboot it.
Yeah, I think comics are different than, like, if you're adapting a book, comics are different, because comics come out, regularly. They come out every month or whatever their schedule is. But they come out frequently, and they're not designed to stay the same. If you write a novel, it's written, and it's generally the characters, a lot of times are designed to stay the same, unless there's some kind of classic character that can be reinterpreted again and again. And that's the way Batman and Sherlock Holmes and characters like that are. But I mean, basic, a novel that doesn't have people that are bigger than life, but has just sort of everyday folks in it, is interpreted one way. If you're trying to take that novel and turn it into something for the screen, I think you try to stick to that book. But what do you do when you do comics? Because there's no singular interpretation that everybody can agree on. There's people who to this day think that the 60s television show is the epitome of what Batman was about, or that the 50s comic was it, or that the later 60s comics or the 70s comics or whatever time you want to pick, the 80s, whatever. And so everybody's got a different vision of that. But like if you read To Kill a Mockingbird, it's just To Kill a Mockingbird. There aren't 100 ways to interpret Scout or those other characters. Now, if a character becomes bigger than life, then sometimes they become an archetype more than they become a character, and they can be expanded on. And like Sherlock Holmes, for example, or Batman, for example, Superman, Tarzan. I mean, characters like that are almost designed to be reinterpreted, or they have been done so often that we can't think of them as any way but characters that are constantly reinterpreted for new generations.
Exactly. One of the things I want to bring up, like we've focused more on your comic writing and screenwriting, but you said at the beginning of the interview that your favorite thing to write is prose fiction. Now,
yes.
Now obviously you've done a lot of different short stories and in many ways I think if people unfairly classify you as a horror writer because you've written so many different within so many different genres. It's kind of like when people classify John Carpenter as a horror director when he's done so many different things. What are some of your favorite books? What are some of your favorite stories that you've written as an author?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I have written so many short stories. I think there's probably close to 300 of them. I don't think I'm overstating that. I haven't actually sat down and counted them. I've had people say it's higher than that. Some say it's a little lower than that, but have, kind of kept up with it. But it's a lot of them. And they vary tremendously. But but Nightly Mr. Horror Show is perhaps, without a doubt, my favorite of all my short stories. I think it was a game changer for me. I think it was a way of understanding what it was I was trying to do, finding my voice and all that. And I think I've written some very, very fine stories since, maybe some as good or better. But that one, A Tight Little Stitches in a Dead Man's Back, which I'm very, very fond of, on the far side of the Cadillac Desert with dead folks. Of course, Bubba Ho-Tep, The Folding Man, which is pure horror. It's not designed. The others have characterization and elements of, I guess, thematic depth and all that, but The Folding Man is just pure, guts and blood and excitement and passion and pacing. And so I like it because it's somewhat different than the others. All of them are somewhat different, but that one is more of just a pure horror one. So it goes into my list, but that list of the ones that I wrote that I like to get longer, not because I'm egotistical, but because I love writing and I try to write stuff I really care about. So if you're asking me what my favorite is, I can give you a handful, but after that it's sort of saying, what's your favorite child or your favorite dog? And there are some that I really believe that I'm not as attached to at all, or sometimes I don't even remember that one that well, but there are a large number of them that have satisfied me in different ways at different times in my career.
Now, you mentioned the Folding Man and it being a pure horror story. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was actually, speaking of pure horror stories, Incident on and Off the Mountain Road. Now, I personally have never got to read the short story, but I have watched the episode on the Master of Horror episode multiple times. And looking at the episode and looking at your original story, what do you think of what was the adaptation, and just as an author, like just objectively from the outside looking in? What do you think of the episode and the adaptation?
I was very pleased with it. I mean, I felt like that they added quite a bit of stuff in the middle there, but I think they kind of had to for the simple reason that it was so short. In this case, this is one of those things, if they had done the literal adaptation, it would have been about 20 or 30 minutes long. Most of the stuff with Buddy in the basement, that doesn't even exist in my story. That was added by Don and Stephen Romano. But I thought it was very effective, and I thought it sort of, and this is one of those cases where In the Spirit of was kind of true. But it was very much my story. It was, I think that center part was a little bit different, but the beginning and the end and elements in the middle, I would say it's not an exact adaptation, but it's certainly a sincere and dedicated adaptation, so that if you've read the story, you won't go, oh, they didn't do the story at all, because they did. And I thought Returner was just fantastic, and I mean, in fact, I thought it was well directed, well acted by everyone, so I was very pleased with it.
And what can you tell us about working on Bar Talk, By the Hair of the Head, Creepers, some of your recent new work coming out? What can you tell us about those?
Well, Barfly is a very short story of mine, and my friend, did it. It's one of those. Lowell Northrop, by the way, he directed it, and I think he pretty much did it almost exact. He took the short story. He had to add some things because in the story it's all done as a monologue by one person, and they had to add the other guy, give him some lines. I think it would have worked. It works just fine in the story without it, but I think it kind of gives it more, give and take that way, and then I think somebody watching it would be more pleased with that. But it's almost a literal adaptation. I was very happy with it, and I guess partly because it was literal, and I thought it was really well done for just two guys sitting at a bar having what gradually becomes a disturbing and oddball conversation. So I'm pleased with that. And Lowell Northrop is working with me, and Jim Mickle and Nick D'Amici and Nick Shoemaker and a number of other people on the Happen Leonard series, which are based on my character. So it's sort of like all of us, the people from Cold in July and the people from that particular low budget short film, we're all working together again. So I'm excited about that because there's an actual passion for and a reverence, or at least strong word. You can't be reverent and do it right. That's too much. But there's a respect for my work from all those people. So, yeah, it was very good. And it won a number of film festival recognitions. So I was happy with it. As far as By the Hair of My Head, I like it too. I've seen it, and I was very pleased and very surprised at how good it looked and how well it worked. And so, you know, we'll see how it is on the that one hasn't come out yet, but we'll see what kind of a response it gets. But I was happy with it.
Now, as a writer, you know, it has to be flattering to have, because you know, you look at the work that was the films adapted from your work, and really, it was every couple of years you would get like a TV show or a movie based off something that you did, and then the last like 2 years, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. You've got what, like 6 or 7 projects directly adapted from your work.
There's the Happy Leonard television series, A Cold in July, obviously just came out. The Bottoms with Bill Paxton, we're going to be doing that, I hope, soon. There's a couple of others that I can't mention the names, but they are very much in the mill. One of them is reasonably definitive, the other less so. But it looks like it's going to happen. And there's another television show that's been optioned. Whether it gets made is another thing. There's at least 2 more novels that are under option. So the options continue. I've been getting options for film, though, since the 80s. And people don't realize I've been making money off film from options where they planned to make the films and didn't, as well as writing screenplays. One of my books, The Big Blow, was optioned by Ridley Scott. I wrote a screenplay. I think David Lynch had it first. Then Ridley Scott had it. And then I wrote a screenplay, and they bought the screenplay, and then they bought out the film rights, of course not my literary rights, but the film rights to it for, you know, a nice and sizable amount of money, and then they never made it. And they did the same thing that was done in France with Dead in the West, with a production company there. So I've been actually being paid for things that haven't been made for years and years. Those 2 are sold out, so if they never make them, then they just lie fallow. But most of the time, things are just optioned, and they come back to me, and they're re-optioned. Dead in the West was optioned 10 or 11 times before it was finally bought out. You know, I've had Cold in July was optioned 7 years and didn't get made, then it went fallow, and then it was optioned another 7 years by Jim and Nick, and it got made. And Linda Moran, who is a great producer. I should have mentioned her earlier, by the way. So, you know, I've been doing that all along, but it's kind of cool now to see these things starting to actually get made. And I'm not sure why that is. I had somebody say, well, they're ready for you now.
So one of our fans and one of your fans actually had a question he wanted us to ask you.
Okay, sure.
Looking at Jonah Hex, like we were talking about earlier, obviously you have a lot of passion for the project, and he was saying that he was wondering if you've ever considered proposing a script for either a follow-up movie or possibly even just starting fresh in regards to a Jonah Hex film.
I would love to do it, but the thing is that, you know, to go in and propose it right now after they've had one that was an absolute disaster. And in fact, I wish that there was the original screenplay that was done, which I've read recently, was really quite good, and it was based very securely off of my interpretation of Jonah Hex. It was my Jonah Hex, not necessarily my exact, you know, comics I had written, but it was certainly the Jonah Hex I created, and there were certainly aspects of it that were very much from the comics I had written. But I think, you know, they're funny like that. You can't just propose something and say, I want to do this. They have to sort of come to you, or they sort of decide. And a lot of times they don't come to the people who wrote the comics for whatever reason. And, you know, if somebody would come to me and say, hey, you want to write a new Jonah Hex movie, I'd damn sure consider it. I'd love to do it. But right now, especially with this one having failed so badly, I don't know if that's going to be done anytime soon. Now, animated, that might happen. I did the short animated script recently, and I did Batman the Animated Series, which had Jonah Hex as the main character in it when they had the one that went back in the past where they talked about Jonah Hex and Ra's al Ghul. So, you know, I'm certainly open to that. And even the animated series, the animated version of it, or a cinematic version. So, hey, come ask me.
So, speaking of that, what did you think of on the Justice League Unlimited series a couple years back? What do you think of their interpretation of Jonah Hex, especially with having Adam Baldwin do the voice?
I like that whole series. I don't remember Hex being in it tremendously, but I liked the series a lot. And I like the Justice League, and then I like the Justice League Unlimited. I was asked to write for the Justice League Unlimited, or if I asked if I wanted to write for it and see if I could, pitch what I wanted to do and come up with some idea, but I just didn't have time. At that time, I was working really heavily on novels and short stories, and I don't remember all, but I just didn't have time to do it. But I would have loved to have pitched something and hopefully have shot at that series, because I liked it. I liked it a lot. And it was a different interpretation, but like I said, these things are open to different interpretations. There are different people writing Hex now, and that's just the way it is, and that's what happens, is that the moods of the country change, the moods of the readers change, and the people who write them have different backgrounds, different personalities. So they're sort of designed, comics are designed to evolve. And the only thing that I don't like is when you get away from the core of the characters to such an extent that you no longer recognize them. I think probably one of the finest things that's been done is equally one of the worst things that's been done, and that's making the characters all darker and having all this angst. I think a certain amount of that has made them more realistic and more interesting, but now you just expect for the character soon to pull out all of his, skeletons in the closet and go into his angst mode, and, I would like to see somebody who says, you know what, I'm doing some good stuff, I have superpowers and I'm saving people. And doesn't mean he can't have problems and that there can't be more depth to it than that, but I sort of get tired of that, all these people are living in this world and they have these powers and how terrible that is, when the rest of us are going, damn, I wish I had those powers. I'd like to not age, I'd like to be able to fly, I'd like to be able to, spin a web or whatever the particular power is that you're interested in. So I'd like to see, I think, a little bit more of it go back to the old source where these guys were heroes. Maybe not as literal and simplistic as the sort of jet jaw hero, but, I could use some of that. That wouldn't bother me any.
I think, personally, two writers who seem to have a counterbalance, like half the time they want to do the super realistic and kind of very dark superhero, and then half the time you can tell they're just having fun, are, the pre-mentioned Grant Morrison. And while he's a figure of controversy, I think Mark Millar is somebody who very much half the time wants to make his super dark story, and half the time when he's doing something like Secret Service or the old school Superman comics they used to do under Superman Adventures, you could tell there was that complete glee. And I
get that, and I agree, but it's not exactly what I mean. I mean, The Dark Knight Returns to me is my favorite comic book of all time. There, I've said it. That's my favorite comic book of all time about Batman. That's it right there. Now, I think that it's very nihilistic to some extent, but then he kind of gets his humanity in the end, and he's doing what he thinks is right to save the world. Well, I don't see him as a hero there. I see him as an alternate version of Batman. That was sort of an alternate world to me. I don't mind that. I don't mind that led to the darker Batman. But I don't think because something is dark and has angst makes it more realistic all the time. I think that sometimes not everybody's life is full of angst and darkness. So to me, when people say that's realistic, it is in the sense that you've allowed something to happen to these characters other than just, I'm powerful, I can bend steel. But I'm just saying that you need the two, not so much separate where it's like comic or where it's like dark, but where there's a blending of these, these ideas in just the way real people are. Sometimes, your life may have some darkness in it, sometimes it has some light, sometimes it's a little bit of both simultaneously. And I just think that probably the shading has just gone one way. And to me, it seems even less, what seemed real at first, because it was brought to comics where it had not been there before, now seems to be just the standard way that they're written. What's his button, what's his angst, and that's where we go from. When I did Jonah Hex, even there, it's a darker version, but it's funny too, and it's ironic, and he's both an anti-hero and a hero at the same time. So to me, I just, that's where, and I'm sure people can certainly do that as well or better than I did, but I'm just saying, that's what I think we need a little bit more of, because it's got to where I know that this is fixing to turn dark, everybody's going to be unhappy. And I'd like to see something with a little more shading to it.
I gotta say, that's something about your work and Mark Waid and Kurt Busiek as well that I've always loved. Like, there's there's always been that balance of love for the character and willing to, and wanting to try to make a good, fun story with that character, but having that sense of, that sense of intensity, that sense of danger, and that serious side as well. And that's something that I think the three of you as writers have really excelled at. That's why I've been big fans in particular of you, Wade, and Busick for a long time.
Well, the thing is, too, that you have a variety of characters. You can certainly have some characters that are much darker than others and some. But my problem isn't that some characters are dark. My problem is that they're all the same. Not all, but the largest percentage of them. I can almost pick it up and go, okay, now, what's his horrible problem? His mother's sick or whatever. Those things certainly should be there. Those are elements of the characters. But when that becomes that's all the focus is how dark can we make this character, then it loses this. It's no less in the extreme about how light can we make this character. I don't want to see that either. I want to see more, like I said, shades.
I think a show that pulled that off really well in the last 10 years was probably the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, because there weren't any distinct, this person is evil, this person is good, this person is light, this person is dark. You found yourself being able to understand where everyone was coming from because they had those shades that you were talking about.
Yeah, I didn't see any of that, but that is what I think I'm saying, if I understand you right.
Now, obviously the two areas that you've worked in the most are in in prose and in screenwriting as well. Now, two of the questions I wanted to ask you as we wrap up the interview. After working on Batman and Son of Batman. Batman and Son just sounds like an awesome 50s TV show. After working on Son of Batman and working on the Jonah Hex segment, is there any particular story that you would love to, any particular comic story that you'd love to be able to adapt into the film or animation medium?
Well, I never say never that there's not going to be any, but I'm almost feeling that, I did Hellboy stories. I did a Hellboy novella. I did, Lone Ranger comics. I did the Jonah Hex, obviously. I did Batman for the animated series. I've done, even Supergirl I did with Neil Barrett Jr. I did one, sort of short story in a, collection of, Supergirl comics. There's been a lot of, I did a Fantastic Four comic that was done for somewhat younger readers. So I've done a lot of the ones that I want to do. I'm kind of at the point where I'd just rather do my own stuff 99.9% of the time. Be it creating my own comic, be it writing novels or screenplays or what, because I'm less interested in working with characters that are not creator-owned. And I'm less interested in working in characters that, I feel like that if I do it, it's like dropping a rock down the well, because everybody else is doing these characters too. I'd like to be the guy that creates the character that everybody else wants to do. And so when I've written the Happen Leonard series, I've been very pleased at the number of readers I've had, that the fact that these characters have become popular with a large number of readers. And so, that's very pleasing. And so I feel like I'm leaning more and more towards doing my own stuff, which I've done 98% of my career anyway. But that 2% where I have not, I think I'd like to just, dwindle that to almost nothing, because I prefer to write my own work. All of that said, if somebody came to me and had some really cool offer, like do a Jonah Hex animated TV series, or do a Jonah Hex animated film, or do a regular Jonah Hex film, then I might be so inclined. But in general, I think I've sort of moved on from that particular thing. I did a Tarzan novel. I did a Tarzan novella recently for Wolves of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I did a John Carter of Mars stories for Under the Moons of Mars. I even wrote a Zorro short story. And all of those sort of things I did as sidelines and things that were nostalgic to me and exciting to me as a sort of taking that inner child and letting it loose. But I think I'd rather do my own stuff more now. And like I said, I've been doing that 98%, but I think I'd almost like to do it nearly 100%.
So, speaking of that, what is the next project that you have coming up that you can talk to us about?
Yeah, well, I have a novella coming out from Subterranean Press called Black Hat Jack. And then next year I have a new novel coming out from Little Brown's Mulholland branch, which is a giant historical called Paradise Sky. I just had The Thicket come out, last year, and the paperback version comes out this year. So I've got the paperback version of The Thicket coming out, Black Hat Jack, the novella, and then early next year I have Paradise Sky.
There was about a month or two ago regarding the recent event you worked on with George R. Martin. For our article.
Yes.
Now, as we know, George R. Martin has an extremely obscure series of books called Game of Thrones. I mean, we know it's bombing viewer-wise, but HBO keeps telling them, they keep it going. They're cool about it. And by that, I mean the show is insanely successful, as are the books. Now, I wanted to ask you what happened with with that project. Like, what brought that about, and what was the event? What was the idea of the event for our listeners at home?
Well, I think what you're talking about, there's two things that I wrote a bunch of novellas for anthologies that George and Gardner Doswat did. I did that with them, and then we had an event out at his theater in Santa Fe where they showed Cold in July, Bubba Ho-Tep, and my daughter, who is a professional singer, came out and did a performance there too, and we did a book signing. But there's never been anything that George and I are writing together. It's just that he had an anthology that he was editing, and there's a variety of people in it, and I'm one of them. And it's not just one anthology. There have been several. There was Warriors, there was Rogues, which is the most recent one. There was Dangerous Women, Old Mars, and one forthcoming called Old Venus. So I assume that that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So,
But they're all done. Done them all, and just waiting for the last one to be published.
It's definitely something I know a lot of people are looking forward to, considering
George Martin is one of the really good guys. I've known George for over 30 years. We're not been the closest of friends, but we've known each other that long, and he's one of those guys that success hasn't changed him a bit, except he has more money. But he is just a really good guy and a really good dedicated writer, and I think a lot of it. He's a really good man.
Although you just don't grow too attached to any of the characters in the story, because they'll all die.
I like that about him. I like the fact that he's not afraid to kill off somebody that he's... it doesn't matter if you kill off somebody you don't like or that's not interesting. It only matters if the person that you care dies or if the person that you care about survives. Either way, either extreme, you have to care about them for any of the kind of characterization to matter.
Exactly, because you look at... before we wrap up the interview, I just wanted to mention a very infamous comic book that came out a few years back, and it was Ultimatum by Jeff Loeb, where literally it was just a book of killing. Yeah, there wasn't any rhyme or reason to it, and he didn't really do enough within the story itself to really make you care. It was just killing for the sake of killing.
I agree with you, but I am going to say that every now and again, I don't mind somebody doing something just purely for experimental sake. I've written stories where nobody is likable, and you're just looking at them, you're just amazed. It's more a thing of looking at it and say, how can this be? Because sometimes they are. I mean, you see people do such horrible things, and you don't know anything about them. That doesn't mean that they don't have, in their view anyway, some form of motivation, whatever. But sometimes I like just these dark moments. Bruce Timm and I did a thing called Red Romance. And yet, there is an attachment between the two main characters in it, but they're not good characters. The only really goodness for them is their strange worldview, which connects them. But if anybody in their right mind looks at this, they're very nihilistic, which I'm not, for example, and neither is Bruce. But it was sort of like opening up something and looking inside of it just purely out of curiosity, not because we wanted to live there, or that we like them, or that we believe their point of view, but because not everyone has the same point of view, and that's one of the things about people, and that's what as a writer, that's what you study. I think that in comics, I think that's even more. I think it's less so in the sense that if you create comic heroes, you have to believe that they are heroic for some reason or another. That's why they call them superheroes, not super folk. They're superheroes. I think it's a little different approach. But that doesn't mean that comics can't do the same things that literature does, at least as far as how it presents things. Because I don't have this I'm just saying that the problem with comics doing what they're doing is it's predictable. It's the same stuff over and over. We know every character is going to be a certain way, and that, Mama didn't love him or didn't treat him right or whatever the situation might be. It's just predictable. We know what's going to happen. But that doesn't mean that you can't be variable in comics. That's what I'm talking about. And the same thing with stories, even more so, because you're not working off a dedicated, long-term, created character that everybody's already invested in, the sense that we know who this character's supposed to be. If we want to read Batman and he has superpowers, unless there's some reason that he has those in some temporary form, or that becomes a gradual change to who he is. But if he can do things that he couldn't do before, it loses those aspects that makes Batman interesting. Same way with Sherlock Holmes, whatever. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Regardless of that, I've got to, you were absolutely right. And as someone who remembered reading Red Romance in the issue of Flinch, in many ways, I think it was Flinch number 11, if memory serves me. But,
I don't remember, to be honest with you.
But, what I remember when I read it, having grown up on the animated series, on Batman the Animated Series, Superman the Animated Series, in many ways it almost felt like, I know it's a weird way to say it, but it almost felt like a personal exercise, like a stretching exercise of someone who had worked in a medium where he was, while there was definitely a stronger sense of freedom with the Bruce Timm Batman the Animated Series universe, it almost felt like people stretching and being able to work outside of those limitations.
Somebody mentioned it once. I was at San Diego Comic Con a few years to Bruce, and we were there, and I was standing there, and he said, I should have known that I was going to do this with Lansdale. It was going to be messed up. But Bruce is a tremendous talent. I also did a Rocketeer thing with him where I wrote a kind of pulp story in a pulp style that he illustrated. And this was Bruce's idea, and the basic storyline was something he was suggested to me to work on. But see, that was one is so unlike the other that it just goes to show that you don't always have to write the same way. You don't always have to have the same view. The characters do not have to represent who you are. That doesn't mean you can tell the difference when somebody's trying to preach something to you to believe it if it's totally against what you believe. But if it's just showing you people who believe something you don't believe, it's like if you read To Kill a Mockingbird and you have a racist in that book, the book isn't racist. The book is anything but that. It's anti-racist. But there are certainly racists in the book. You see, it's different. But if you read a book where it's trying to say that this is a good thing, then you can feel the difference immediately, rather than it's just an observational thing that's looking at these characters and letting these characters be themselves, and you're observing them because this is part of the human condition, and in the case of Atticus, who is the lawyer in Gilmore, he is the force of good, but he is also a variable character. There's different things about him that, even though he's probably really, really good, he has his doubts, he has his moments, and I just love it when you just take a sort of bird's eye view of these things, and you don't moralize everything you do in a big, heavy-handed way.
I completely agree, and I've got to say this is easily one of the most fascinating interviews I've had on here, both as a
well, thank you.
Just as a reader and as a writer myself, and it's like we've had writers on in the past, but rarely have we gotten into this amount of depth. And I gotta tell you, as an interviewer, as a host on a website, how much I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I don't want to sound like I was trying to monopolize stuff here, but anyway, we got a chance to talk, and I enjoyed it.
Oh, definitely. So, for those on this wonderful internet, where can they find you, Joe?
Well, I have a fan page, which is, just easy to find, Joe Lansdale, and you just look it up on Facebook. It's a fan page. And then I have www.joerlansdale.com, and there's one D in Lansdale, not two. And so it's www.joerlansdale.com is my web page. So go, and then I'm on Twitter. So those are three places that you can find me easily enough.
All right. It was fantastic having you on the show. And remember, people, keep going to our website, like us on Facebook, and keep reading Joe's books, or we'll have him come over and break your legs. Okay, we won't do that, but you know.
Well, thank you very much.